Andi Herman and welcome to this introductory patchwork class, Patchwork 101. This is a class for people who've never tried patchwork before. Maybe you've seen some gorgeous quilts, you've been to a quilt show, or somebody's had a wonderful quilt in their home and you've thought, I wish I could do that. This is the class for you. This might also be a class for somebody who's been trying out their hand at patchwork for a little while and might be looking for some tips and tricks and some corners to cut, so there might also be something in here for you. Patchwork has been around for centuries. Patchwork started out of necessity when people were needing to keep warm and they would take clothing that they had perhaps that they'd grown out of, clothing that was too ripped and torn to wear. They'd select the best pieces of fabric from those bits of clothing and sew them together to make warm, comforting quilts to sleep under. Patchwork is now a whole industry where designers are designing especially for the patchwork market, and you can buy beautiful fabrics that are especially made for this purpose. So what is patchwork? Patchwork is when you take some fabric, you cut it up into smaller pieces and sew it back together in a pleasing design. Something like this. So here I've got 4 pieces of fabric that I've cut up into smaller squares and sewn them together, and that's what we would call patchwork. It's not yet a quilt. A quilt is something a little bit different, and let me show you that. So here's an example of the beginnings of a quilt. A quilt has 3 layers. It has a quilt top, which in this case is a single piece of fabric. It has a middle, which is often referred to as batting or wadding and can be made of a number of different fibres. And it has a quilt back. And these 3 layers we call our quilt sandwich. And once you have your quilt sandwich put together, you can do quilting stitches to hold those 3 layers firmly in place. And those stitches can be all sorts of different things. They can be decorative stitches, like these ones here, or wiggly stitches, or any kind of stitches that you like. Once you have those 3 layers held firmly together with your beautiful quilting stitches, then we can say you have a quilt. This class is about the patchwork. And because we're a beginner's class, we are going to start with our basic patchwork shape, which is a square. Doesn't mean your quilt has to look simple. It can look simply stunning because of the choice of fabrics and how you put those fabrics together. But for a beginner who's just trying out patchwork for the first or second or maybe even the 3rd time, starting with squares I find is a much easier place to start, so that you can get the idea of how to place the pieces together, how to make your corners meet, those sorts of things, and you can still come up with a glorious end result. So you can make wonderful quilts using something as simple as the humble square. I have a couple of samples here that I've made for my friends' children when they were born. Here we have one that was made for a little boy with, again, just simple squares, but the choice of fabrics just makes it really something special and something that you can give and feel really wonderful about making a handmade item. And again, a similar concept, just squares, but with girlier fabrics for a little girl, and in this case, larger squares, which makes it a little bit easier to make, and you've got a whole different gorgeous look. And here's another example of what you can do with the humble square. These squares are much, much smaller than the ones I've already shown you, but they've been placed in such an order that it can look very sort of scrappy and thrown together, but if you look carefully at the design of the quilt, you'll see that the placement of fabrics creates a unique design. This is known as a scrappy trip around the world pattern. And again, it's all using very, very simple square pieces. So what we learned today, you can make something as simple or as complex as you like. So let's talk about fabric. Shopping for fabric is one of my favourite parts of the process, where you get to go and choose all the gorgeous colours that you want to use and the different designs in your fabric pieces. There are different ways you can go about selecting your fabrics. First of all, you don't have to use cotton. You can use fabrics that are polyester, fabrics that have a stretch to them, fabrics from t-shirts, from old sheets, anything you like. My recommendation though, especially for beginners, is to choose a specialty patchwork fabric which is made of cotton, because it's easier to use, it's not going to stretch out of shape as you piece it together, and it's designed specifically for this purpose. So while strictly speaking, you can use really any fabrics you like in a piece of patchwork, let's say that for a beginner's class, we're going to stick with the specialty patchwork fabric. You can find fabrics at many online stores where you can go and select the fabrics you want to buy and have them delivered straight to your door. There are advantages and disadvantages to this approach. The advantages being you can sit in your own home, click, 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 select the items that you want and have them delivered straight to your door. In your local patchwork store, you can sit down with somebody who knows all the fabrics that are in the shop. They can help you choose a palette that you love, and they can also give advice about how much fabric to buy and exactly how to put your quilt together. And that's really an incredibly valuable resource to have. And if we don't continue to support our local bricks and mortar fabric stores, then they're going to disappear and we won't have access to those fabulous resources anymore. So please make good use of those resources. Okay, so let's talk about cutting your fabric. You could very easily take a ruler and a pencil and draw lines on your fabric and cut it out with your regular sewing scissors. That would be fine, but certainly there are much more accurate and faster ways to go about cutting your fabric. So I'm just going to put these to the side. You can see on the table that we have a nice large cutting mat. These are self-healing cutting mats, so I can put a blade onto this mat and cut, and it's not going to leave a nasty cut mark on the blade, and I can continue to cut the fabric in various places and it's not going to damage the mat. These mats come in lots of different sizes. This is a nice large one. You can get smaller ones if you're traveling around and want to do some cutting at a friend's house, and even teeny tiny ones if you're cutting very small pieces of fabric. And in terms of the rulers that you choose to use, there's also some options. You might choose to have some small rulers on hand. This is my favourite ruler. I find it's helpful for most of the cutting that I need to do. It's 24 inches by 6.5 inches and should be easily available at most of the patchwork stores that you visit. You'll see that there's lots of marks on the ruler which shows the inch marks, half-inch marks, quarter-inch marks, and even marks to 1/8 of an inch so that you can cut your fabric really accurately. There are lots of different options in terms of sizes for rulers and cutting mats, and you might eventually build up a bit of a collection like I have, but for your first one, you might want to go into your local patchwork shop and let them guide you as to what might be the best first purchase for you. Rather than using your regular sewing scissors for cutting your fabric, we have these fantastic tools called rotary cutters, which are kind of like pizza cutters for fabric, and they make the cutting process so much easier. And I'll show you how. But first, let's just have a look at some of the different options. There are different styles of rotary cutters. There's ones where the covers just come backwards and forwards. There's ones where you have a lock in place and then you can open up to expose the blade, or ones like this one where once you unlock it, all you need to do is press and the sharp blade comes through. There are different sizes of rotary cutters. This is one of the larger ones, that's more of a medium size. There's all different options. Again, my suggestion is to go to your local patchwork shop and let them help you decide what might be the best option for you. So now let's cut our fabric. Here's the first piece of fabric we're going to cut. I've pressed it nicely, but you'll see that I have left the manufacturer's fold in place. So this comes up and around to the other side. And on the edges here, we have what's known as the selvage, which is the edge of the fabric that tells you who made the fabric, who designed it, and information about the different colours on it. The reason we keep the manufacturer's fold in place is because it helps us to guide our cutting process, and we can iron that out later once we've cut our pieces. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our piece of fabric, which is already folded in half by the manufacturer, and we're going to fold it again so that our manufacturer's fold lines up perfectly parallel with the lines of our selvage at the edge, which should give us a nice clean cut along the side. Now we actually get to start cutting. Now the reason all of our cutting tools have a locked position is because these blades are super sharp, so please be careful, and when you're not using them, pop them into your locked position. But I'm going to open it up. A nice sharp blade is really helpful because it'll cut through your fabric like butter. It's fantastic. So the first thing we need to do is square up the edge of your fabric. So we take our ruler and we're just going to remove a little bit of the edge so that we know that that side is nice and square. So I'm using the lines on my ruler. The line here comes along nicely against the fold I've just created in the fabric, and I've got a nice line here that's also in line with the manufacturer's fold. So I know that this is going to be a nice even fold. I hold down nice and steadily with my left hand, tools in my right hand, press down, cut. And it's as simple as that. Now it can take a little bit of practice to get used to your particular tools and to work out exactly how comfortably they feel in your hands, but once you get the hang of it, you'll find it's so quick and easy. Also, I'm a right-hander, so if any of you are left-handers, all you need to do is change my instructions so that whenever I say left hand, swap it for right hand, etc. Now that we have our nice clean edge on the edge of our fabric, we're going to flip it over to the other side, which in this case is the left side for me. We're going to use our ruler and use the markings on our ruler to help us do the first cut. Now I've decided in this quilt that our quilt squares are going to be 4 inches from top to bottom and side to side. But that's not the size I'm cutting. I'm going to cut at 4.5 inches to allow some seams where our squares will come together. And in patchwork we use a 1/4 inch seam allowance as a rule, which means I have a 1/4 inch on this side and a 1/4 inch on that side, which means that whatever size I want the quilt square to end up being, I add 1/2 inch. I'm going to measure my 4.5 inches. What I like about this quilt is that it's 6.5 inches. It gives me a nice little 1/2 inch measurement on the side. So I can say, here's my 1/2 inch, 1, 2, 3, 4 inches, and my line lines up nicely on the edge there, and I've got a nice square line at the bottom too, so I know that this is going to be a true square when I cut it. Now again, holding carefully with your left hand, tools in your right hand, line it up and away you go. And there's our first cut to start making our squares. So now we open up our strip. We have a nice long strip of fabric. And at one edge we have our selvages, and at the other edge we have our manufacturer's fold. And what we're going to do is we're going to cut off the selvage edge, just like we squared up the piece of fabric earlier. Line up our ruler nicely so we have a nice line at the top and a nice line at the bottom. Hold steady with the left hand, right hand press and cut to remove the selvages. And we now have a nice cut piece at the end, which we're going to turn around. And now we can start cutting our squares from our strip. So again, we line up our ruler with a nice line at the top and at the bottom, and lined up at the side at the 1, 2, 3, 4.5 inch point. We hold it in place and cut. And here are our first 2 squares. We can just keep cutting until the whole strip is cut. So there we go. And our next one. Lining it up carefully each time. Now, we don't have enough fabric here to cut 2 pieces at 4.5 inches, but there's probably enough in there to cut 1. So we open it up, and because we were so careful before with lining up our fabric and squaring the edge, this line here is nice and straight once you've opened up your fabric. And I place my ruler again in the 4.5 inch square point, press, cut, and we have 1 more piece. We'll give a little press to get rid of the fold, and there we go. And this piece you can keep in your scrap box to put together for your next quilt, which will be made up of all sorts of scraps from your previous quilts so that you can see where you've been. It's lots of fun. So just continue cutting all of your fabrics until you've got a whole lot of squares that you can put together into your quilt. And now it's time for us to head to the design wall. And this is the patchwork piece we'll be working towards in this class. So now we come to the part where we get to actually lay out our quilt and create the design that we're going to sew together. Behind me I have what we call a design wall, which is really nothing more complicated than a piece of your wadding which is attached to the wall. You could use wadding, you can use a piece of flannel, there's a whole, anything that fabric will adhere to, like that, is a great thing that you can use for a design wall. If you don't have room for a design wall at your place, I know I've been in a situation before where I've used a design floor, which is also perfectly acceptable, unless you have cats and dogs in the house, because there is absolutely guaranteed, as soon as you start putting your patchwork fabric on the floor, that's where they're going to want to go and sit. So that's another thing just to keep in mind. I think cats and dogs were made for patchwork. They just love it, and patchworkers seem to love cats and dogs too. So here are the pieces that I've cut up in all my different fabrics, ready to go, and I'm going to see if I can create a nice design. So now you can start placing your squares of fabric onto the design wall to see what works for you. Maybe a bit of pink, maybe some silver next, and we're going to keep going until we've got the right number of squares across, and then we'll start working down. Now you might find that your pieces don't want to stay up all by themselves necessarily, so you can just grab a pin and pin your pieces in place if that helps them to stay put where you want them. Let's go for this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's say we're going to go 7 across. And let's have a look at the next level. Now I've chosen a green. I think maybe we'll stagger them a bit. Maybe this one can go here. Now, standing back, you might look at that and say, no, I don't like those two reds right next to each other like that. So simple as doing this. And you might think, that's much better for me. And you keep going. So there's one option for a design for your quilt where the pieces are placed fairly randomly, but I've got a nice spread of the greys and the greens and the pinks and the reds, and to me that looks nice and balanced to my eye. If you're not 100% sure whether or not your quilt looks nice and balanced, one trick that you can do is to take a photograph of it, and looking through your camera lens with a digital camera gives you a very different kind of perspective on how your quilt design looks. And if you really want to see whether or not the colours are nice and balanced, if you can change your image, the photograph that you've taken, to black and white, that'll really give you a nice idea of whether or not there's a nice balance of the values in the colours. So here's another option that you can choose. You might choose something a little bit more structured. As you can see here, I've gone with stripes of colour, gradually going from the darker green through to the lighter greens, the greys, the pinks, and finishing at red. So if you prefer something a bit more structured, you might like to go for something like this. If you're happier with something that's a little bit more scrappy looking, then you could go with the other design that we came up with earlier. Once you've got a design that you're happy with, the next step is to take it down in such a way that it makes sense once you start sewing. So let's do that. I'm going to take the top row. I'm going to call it row number 1. I'm using very sophisticated equipment here. I've ripped up a piece of paper and I've written a 1 on it with a marker. And just a simple safety pin to mark the beginning of my row 1, and then I'm going to carefully take it off and place it in a pile, knowing that where the marker is at the left of my quilt, and all the other pieces need to move to the right as I sew them together. And I'll continue to do this with all the rows. Okay, so now we're ready to sit down at the sewing machine. You can really use just about any domestic sewing machine and you'll get the job done, no problems. My little sewing machine is a Bernina, and you can see I've got a nice big extension table here which helps extend the surface of my sewing area. But it's not essential, you don't have to have all those sorts of gadgets. Just a basic sewing machine will help you get the job done. One thing that's really useful to have is a 1/4 inch foot. A 1/4 inch foot is one where the needle will pop down in the middle of the foot, and the space between the needle and the edge of the foot is exactly 1/4 inch, which will help us get our 1/4 inch seams for sewing. A 1/4 inch seam is really helpful with patchwork. Many of our patterns talk about sewing with a 1/4 inch seam, and it's really useful to have lots of practice in getting that 1/4 inch seam just right. Having said that, I'm a big fan of not necessarily aspiring to perfection. If your seams aren't perfect, if your points aren't perfectly matched, that's okay. You'll still make an absolutely gorgeous quilt, even if it's not absolutely perfect. So we have our piles that we've taken down from our design board, and here's my row number 1, and I'm going to take my first 2 pieces. My first piece I know is the far left of the row, and the next piece goes alongside it. I'm going to flip them over so that they're right sides together. That's the right side of the fabric, and that's the wrong side of the fabric or the back of the fabric. Right sides together, and I line them up nicely, and I know I want to do my seam along here, along the right hand side. So I'm going to carefully align them so that they're nice and lined up. And here's the trick to getting your 1/4 inch seams. My edge of my fabric is lined up along the right hand side of my 1/4 inch foot. Now, I wouldn't normally sew with this bright red thread. Usually I would choose a more neutral coloured thread that tones in more with the fabrics I'm sewing with, but I wanted you to be able to see the stitches I make, so that's why I've chosen this colour thread. Now, I cut that off, and you can see I've got my nice 1/4 inch seam along the edge of my fabric. If you want to measure that your 1/4 inch seam is a nice 1/4 inch, you take your ruler and simply place it over the top, and you can see from the edge of the ruler, my stitches sit nicely underneath that 1/4 inch mark. Now, something to think about is your choice of thread. We've talked about the choice of colour thread. It's nice to have one that blends in nicely with the fabrics you've chosen, but also the type of thread. Now, we've got cotton fabrics here, so I'm using cotton thread. People who sew garments with polyester fabrics might choose a polyester thread to sew with. And I think the reason for having consistency between your thread and your fabrics is so that they wear at an even rate, and so that they sit nicely together and they'll wash nicely together as well. So I've got my cotton thread, my cotton fabric, and let's keep sewing our row together. So I open up the two that I've done. I keep my tagged number 1 on the end. I take my next piece of fabric and line up the edges nicely, right sides together, and continue to sew. Being mindful of my 1/4 inch seam. Okay, we open up, we take the next one, right sides together, and continue until you've finished your row. There we have the whole row all sewn together. Now, at this stage, you'll notice that I've got some loose threads hanging off the edge. I like to just snip those off, because what you may find is that once your quilt top is all finished and you want to start quilting it, if you've got any light coloured fabrics, your threads may fall behind the fabrics and show through in your finished quilt, and you don't want that to happen. So it's nice to be able to just tidy it up and snip off your threads as you go. Okay, so now you've sewn all your rows together, and it's time to iron them or press them. And believe it or not, there are all kinds of ironing choices. Oftentimes we say that quilters iron to the dark side, a bit like Darth Vader. So you would iron like this one, where this is the darker piece and this is the lighter piece. You'd always iron your seam towards the darker side. But that's not always the case. Another option that some people like to do to reduce bulk is to iron their seams open. Just like that. Now, it's a personal choice. I tend not to do my ironing this way because, for a range of reasons. First of all, it's fiddly and I just don't have the time and the patience, to be honest. But also, when you think about it, when you iron your seams open, there's nothing between this piece of fabric and that piece of fabric than your stitching threads, other than your stitching threads, which I think reduces the strength of your seam just that tiny bit. So I will tend to iron to one side. So here's our first 2 rows that we sewed together. And I've left my numbers pinned on, not only so that that will help me know how to put my whole quilt top together when the time comes, but also so that I can use it for this little trick I'm about to show you now. Row number 1, I'm going to turn it over so that my number marker is at this side near the iron, and I'm going to press and pull all my seams away from my marker. So all my seams are heading in that direction. And I'll do that for all of my odd numbered rows. So for numbers 1, 3, 5, 7, depending on how many rows you have. Now you'll notice I'm not using steam at this point. Again, that's a personal preference. Some people find using steam or even using starch as well gives a nice crisp seam. But I find that with cotton fabrics, using steam can sometimes give the potential for the fabrics to stretch or change shape due to the moisture in the seam. So at this stage, I choose not to. But again, try different things and see what works for you. So that's my number 1 row. Now I'll take my number 2 row, and instead of having my number marker up at this end, I'll pop it up at this end. So that now when I iron, I'm not ironing away from the marker, I'm ironing towards it. And I will do that with all of my even numbered rows, 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. You might be wondering why we've ironed some rows in this direction and some rows in that direction, and I'll show you why now. Here's my row number 1, row number 2, I flip it down so I know I'm ironing the right place, and you will see that my seams, when I have one seam facing this way and one seam facing that way, that they just nestle together nicely. It reduces the bulk in your seam so that you don't have big fat bulky seams to deal with on your quilt, and it really helps to make your points meet nicely. So here's our first 2 rows ready to sew together. They've been nicely pressed in the 2 different directions we talked about, and we're going to sew them together. Now, I don't necessarily pin my rows together when I sew them. I will tend to place them number 1 at the top, number 2 at the bottom, right sides together, and I will tend to just line up my first seam and start sewing. But some of you might want a bit of extra reassurance and might just want to get that seam in place and pop a pin in there. And just continue to do that down the row, lining up your seams and popping some pins in. Now I'll just pin the first few so you can see how that's done. Just like that, but I'll continue the rest of the row without pinning so you can see how I do that as well. So, lining up our 1/4 inch seam, and we begin to sew. Just like we did before, keeping the raw edges of the fabric lined up with the edge of your 1/4 inch foot. As we go along. I like to take the pins out as I get to them so that I don't accidentally prick myself as we go along. Here we go. Now remember, if it's not perfect, it's not the end of the world. Most people won't even notice. All they'll see is a beautiful handmade item that you've made yourself. Okay, now I'm getting up to the section where I haven't used any pins, so what I will tend to do is just line up the next one and sew to that point. If your sewing machine has a needle down function where the needle stops in the down position rather than the up position, it's really helpful when you're sewing these long seams so that the needle holds the fabric in place while you readjust your next seam. You'll find that the fabric has a little bit of give, so if your corners don't meet exactly where you want them to meet, just give the top or the bottom a little pull so that that sits in the right place. And now you've sewn your first 2 rows together. Let's have a look. There we go. So once you open it up, you can have a look and see how you did with your corners meeting. And you'll see that by having the 2 rows ironed in different directions, you get a pretty good result with your corners coming together. I don't think that one's absolutely perfect, but you know what? It's good enough for me. So now you just trim your threads like you did earlier. We have rows 1 and 2 sewn together, and now we just continue on with row 3 and row 4 and row 5 until your quilt top is all sewn together. Now we have to move back to the ironing board. My preference is simply to iron all my rows in one direction. I don't find that with something as simple as squares like this that you get too much bulk in your seams, and it's so much easier to do. So you can see I've got the rows going in different directions and all of my seams are now heading in the one direction in between the rows. And I'll just continue that until my whole quilt top is pressed from the back. And now what I like to do is flip it over so I can see the front. Admire my gorgeous sewing and my beautiful fabrics, and at this point I'll give the front a bit of a press as well, and this time I'll use a bit of steam just to give a really nice crisp look to the front of my quilt. So now that you've finished pressing your quilt top, the next step is to have a good look and admire your gorgeous work.